Hello and welcome to Bookly Fun. Today we are going to be reading part 3 of The Islander by Cynthia Rylant. Part 3, The Photograph. Chapter 9. And now time must pass in my telling to the year I was 17. During the days of my growing from a boy of 10 into a young man, there was always a certain feeling of enchantment in my life. But in these years, I never again experienced anything as magical as when I met the mermaid. I did not see her a second time, nor any sign of her, and had I not worn her key around my neck, I might not have believed in her at all. I might have convinced myself that I had just fallen asleep there in the sea grasses and had merely dreamed her. I might have even told myself the comb was just some sort of rare sea life that had been plucked away as I slept and that carried no real magic at all. But the key I wore was, without a doubt, pure magic. It had saved a child's life it had saved and continued to save countless birds. And I had nothing to do with its power. The key's wonderful knowing was all its own, and I could only be grateful for that privilege of having it. I never removed the key from my neck, ever. I cherished and protected it. Every moment of my life. At night, I would lie in bed holding the key in my palm, and I would think. Always this relaxed me. I would look toward the moon shining in the open window, or stare at the beam where Anna had once carved her name, and I would consider my life, what I had lost and gained, what I hoped for. And always I felt that something truly extraordinary would happen to me again someday. I could not guess what it might be, but I always had an almost giddy sense of anticipation, much like the feeling I'd had when I was 10 and found the mermaid's comb. For 7 years my life had been filled with quiet routine and contentment. I continued to read and to educate myself. A library on the mainland sent me books by ferry. I had a fascination with geography, with history, but I had no plans to pursue a formal education. My grandfather's love of carving was, I discovered, in my blood as well, and I hoped to follow his path in this. Grandfather's work sold well at the coastal galleries. There's always someone on the ferry every few months looking to pick up a new collection. So I carved, studied, and I waited for the future to tell me why my heart was so ready. Then on April 16th of that year, my grandfather and I began that day by releasing a strong, healthy cormorant into the sky. And in the evening of the same day, my grandfather died. He had not been ill, and there had been no signs that he might suddenly die. He simply finished the day like any other, then lay down his head and passed into heaven. The day following the funeral was especially hard for me, and sorrow was hard. Throughout the morning and afternoon, one islander after another stopped by to see how I was, to tell me how much my grandfather would be missed, and each time someone came and went, the lonelier I felt. In the evening, I decided I would sort through the things grandfather had left behind. In this way, I thought I might feel him still with me. I opened the small desk in his bedroom and organized the few letters and bills I found there. I looked through a drawer of broken watches. I sharpened his pencils. I then moved to grandfather's bureau to see if there might be a piece of his clothing, a sweater perhaps, I could wear in memory of him. And as I lifted out a few of the old flannel shirts lying in the top drawer, I came across a worn brown Bible tied with a thin piece of silk ribbon. Sitting down on grandfather's bed, I carefully untied the silk. The need of it was apparent. for several of the delicate yellowed pages were loose. I opened the cover and read, "To my son, Andrew Michael Jennings, on your 6th birthday, love, Mother." I did not know who Andrew Jennings was, but on the next page was a family tree, and I saw that he was my great-grandfather. My grandfather's name, his son, was directly beneath it. Alongside grandfather's name was the name of his sister, Anna Elizabeth. Anna. I smiled. The child in the attic had been my grandfather's sister, but he had not spoken of her. Beneath grandfather's name was my father's name. It was my father's, Ethan. And beneath my father's name was my own. But there were no names beneath Anna Elizabeth's. Carefully, I paged through grandfather's Bible for other revelations. A thin lace handkerchief slid out and a torn piece of music. It seemed part of an old hymn. Then a dried rose, and last, a very old photograph. It was a picture of a young woman, probably in her teens, sitting on a carved wooden chair with a dog at her side. I looked closely at the girl's face. She was beautiful, with kind eyes and thick dark hair flowing to her waist. My gaze then turned to the dog, and my heart stopped, for there, on the dog's forehead, I could see a very unusual marking. A large white diamond. Certain I was dreaming. I turned the photograph over. Written was this: Anna Elizabeth, born 1898, died 1915. Chapter 10. Only one person from my grandfather's youth was, as far as I knew, was still alive, and her name was Hester Maxwell. She lived in a house on the mainland, and I had met her years ago on one of my rare trips off the island. Grandfather had carved an orca for her 85th birthday, and one morning we had crossed on the ferry to her home, shared lunch, then returned. I would likely not have remembered where she lived, except that it was behind a taffy shop, which was, of course, very interesting to me. Grandfather bought several pieces for us. If anyone could tell me anything about Anna, it would be Mrs. Maxwell. So 2 weeks after my grandfather's passing, I carried his Bible across the water to the door of her house. She must guess that by now I completely believed that the mermaid who had come to me so many years before was Anna, the young woman in the photograph. The face of Anna's dog and the face of the otter that had brought the key were too astonishingly alike for me to believe anything else. And realizing this, I was filled with a combination of the most awful anxiety and incredible joy. I was anxious because I now believed that the mermaid who had visited me was a ghost. And the thought of ghosts makes, and has always made, me anxious. But with this, I also felt a profound happiness. Magic is one thing, and it is a marvelous thing, but an everlasting spirit is even more. I needed to know who Anna had been. Mrs. Maxwell was quite frail, but she remembered me right away and invited me inside. She had not been told of my grandfather's death, but I was sorry to tell her, but she was surprisingly calm at the news. Perhaps in old age, death becomes a promise, a good one. After a cup of tea, I unwrapped the Bible in my hands and slipped out Anne's photograph. I handed it to Mrs. Maxwell. "I found this in Grandfather's Bible," I said. "I wonder if you remember her. I believe she was his sister." Mrs. Maxwell gently took the photograph from my hands and carefully brought it up near her eyes. Then all at once she began to cry. I jumped up and fetched some tissues for her from a nearby table. I sat quietly while she dried her wrinkled eyes, all the while murmuring, "Forgive me." Finally she could speak. She handed the photograph back to me and said softly, "When I was growing up on Coquille, Anna was my dearest friend. I thought I would die after we lost her. Lost her? I asked. How? Mrs. Maxwell smiled, but her eyes grew moist again. Anna loved her dog, she answered, more than anything in the world. I've never seen a person so in love with an animal. She sighed deeply, then continued. There was a very bad storm one night. Very bad. Very bad. Many boats were lost. Anna and the dog had gone to the shore to look for her father, who was a fisherman. He'd left that morning and by nightfall hadn't come home. The winds were very bad. Everyone was worried, so Anna went searching for her father. She climbed with her dog to the top of sea stacks, hoping to see her father's boat. Someone saw her there and warned her, tried to get her to come down. But she wouldn't. She stood there with the dog, looking out at the Black Sea. Mrs. Maxwell stopped again. She took 2 deep breaths. A large wave rolled over that rock and swept Anna's dog into the water. The poor thing went under immediately. The water was terrible that night. Anna screamed and called the dog's name. She called and called, but he did not surface, and then Anna dove in. Mrs. Maxwell put her small thin hand to her heart. They were both lost, she whispered. I felt the warm stain of tears behind my eyes. How old was she? I asked. She was exactly your age, said Mrs. Maxwell, 17. She was the loveliest. Mrs. Maxwell shook her head. And Anna's father, his boat? I asked. He'd taken shelter in a cove for the night and came home the next day. Your grandfather was just a boy, only 12, when his sister perished. He'd always been so happy, so outgoing. Ever afterward, he was quiet. Now it was I who sighed deeply, sadly. Mrs. Maxwell looked at me, then placed her warm hand over mine. I'm so sorry, my dear, she said, that you have lost everyone. I lifted my hand and looked at her in surprise. Unbelievably, until that moment, I didn't realize I had. And with that, remember to like, subscribe, and comment.